A little bit about Home Energy Scotland to start with, I think. Just a very brief introduction. We are funded by the Scottish Government and we deliver this service via the Energy Saving Trust. And the whole point of the service is to provide free and impartial energy advice to householders across the whole of the Highlands and Islands, basically to make their homes cheaper and more comfortable. And we also provide a lot of help and support to access funding. We do appreciate that one of the biggest barriers is funding and mechanisms to facilitate change. So it's one area that we can help many householders with. And I think more importantly as well is that we do not cold call. So we only respond to queries that are made directly to our advice centre number. That's a free phone telephone number from everywhere in Scotland, free phone from landlines and mobiles. And from a purely selfish point of view, my interest is the Highlands and Islands. And I have to stress, we do have Shetland in the right place. It's just behind my face here. So I've worked from Shetland right the way down to the Kintyre Peninsula. And I know everyone knows where Inverness is, but I'm here. So we cover all calls from the Highlands and Islands, and a significant portion of our work is in Lochaber. We do find that people tend to be very engaged in the community in Lochaber and are motivated to adopt change. So we do have a high number of calls from the area. In terms of the presentation today, we'll just start off with some of the basics, and this isn't to patronize, it's just to get some sort of context as to exactly what we're talking about here. And the primary interest in terms of electricity and heating is going to be heat demands. You know, how much do I actually need in my property to keep warm and be comfortable? There are umpteen variables on that. I mean, part of my job is surveying properties, so I've been in hundreds and hundreds of houses, well, thousands of houses across the whole area. So I know the challenges, the particular challenges that we face in remote rural locations, and more particularly the fact that off the gas network, a lot of our heating is electric. And that does pose certain specific questions. So in relation to the heat demand in buildings, there's a number of variables, as I say. Obviously the size, the age of the building, the exposure of the property, who's actually in the property as well, number of individuals, whether individuals have underlying health conditions, whether it's kids, do people work from home, is the property empty during the day, do people work shifts, etc. And the most important, I'll go back, I do apologize. The most important factor is the kilowatt hour demand. This is the fundamental importance to the conversation today. It's thinking about kilowatt hours. And that translates to how much energy from our utility suppliers, the demands on our property, and that translates to both carbon and expense. So kilowatt hours is the absolute key here. It's the cost for each unit of heat. And that might not sound particularly interesting, but when we look at the next slide here, now these prices do fluctuate quite widely, but if we look at unit costs of heat in kilowatt hour, this is very, very telling, because for those on the mains gas network, it's 3 to 5 pence per kilowatt hour. In fact, mains gas, you could probably get it about 2.8 pence per kilowatt hour at the moment. Oil fluctuates very widely. It was actually at the height of the first lockdown, oil was down at the equivalent price of 2.9 pence a kilowatt hour. Solid fuel and logs, again, varies widely depending on the bulk and the purchase. LPG, again, is incrementally more expensive, cheaper if it's bulk, i.e. the big tanks, and more expensive if it's smaller bottles. And then electricity is a huge range in price, from 9 to about 22 pence per kilowatt hour. And I think from our point of view, for our discussion today, is I'm sure many of us are probably fairly sick and tired of hearing about average costs to heat a home, because it's always using mains gas prices, and it doesn't illustrate the fundamental difficulties and challenges we have in our part of the world. and looking at those figures there, it's very, very telling, the challenge that we have. If you look at the unit cost of electricity, they're potentially up at 20 plus pence per kilowatt hour in comparison to mains gas prices. It's a huge, huge difference, and that does have fundamental implications on a whole host of issues. So if we move on to types of electric heating, and at any point, please feel free to stop me here. But I've just tabulated some electric heating types. Again, this is not to patronize individuals in any way, shape or form. It's just a sort of a framing, a discussion point here. I've deliberately kept renewable heat separate, and that'll be on my next slides. So if we concentrate on firstly, electric dry heat and some of the misconceptions. So if we look at electric, that's we can panel heats, plug-in heaters, high heat retention storage heaters, that type of thing. The misconception with storage heaters in particular is they're inefficient. They're not. They're 100% efficient. They will convert all their input to heat. So every electrical unit that goes into a storage heater will be converted to heat. So it is efficient. The difficulty is that there's a complete lack of control. So it's not effective. And there's just a subtle difference there. Effectiveness and efficiencies don't mean the same thing. Lack of control means it's not effective. Not effective means it's uncomfortable and expensive. So I think, you know, just using those very simple terms just highlights some of the issues. To compound this, what we have with electric heating is the variance in meter types. So you can have dual meters, which are quite common, economy 7 and economy 10. You can also have, particularly in our part of the world, the big issue is with your restricted meter, your total heating, total control. So a restricted meter is quite a challenging tariff because it's expensive and there are certain understandings that people need to have on how a restricted meter actually operates. And many people are actually on a restricted meter. It may well be that some of you here tonight are on a restricted meter on a THTC tariff. And this makes the whole electric conversation slightly more complicated because it's not just a simple case of what heating type you have, but the meter type is really quite important as well. So broadly speaking, if you have a house which has just got a series of panel heaters in it, just basic heaters that are hung off the wall, then you would normally be on a single rate tariff. And there's plenty of people who have that. Tends to be in smaller properties, I have to say. So I've got a friend who lives in a 1-bedroom flat, and he's just got a panel heater in his main living and kitchen area, and a panel heater in the bedroom, and a towel rail in the bathroom. And that suits fine. Single rate meter and panel heaters, that works okay. Nothing wrong with that. In a larger property, slightly more problematic because panel heaters can be expensive to run on scale. So it's getting the context right for the property as well. The most common type of heating, electric heating across the Highlands and the islands is storage heating. Now, storage heaters will operate on the dual rate. Economy 7, you can get a fairly competitive economy 7 tariff, whereby you have a night charging rate and a daytime rate. So basically a storage heater on an economy 7 tariff will be on a whole house switch. So have 1 meter, but 2 rates. And usually speaking, at about 11 o'clock at night, the whole house will switch over to a cheaper rate. So that will charge the storage heaters at a cheaper rate. And then about 7 o'clock in the morning, it will flip back to your day rate, and that'll be on your peak tariff. So trying to assess what a fuel bill will be like, it can be more challenging than just say, for example, mains gas or oil, because that's more straightforward to work out in terms of the heating cost. The big issue we have with storage heaters is that if the controls are oops, I think it's just moving on after 5 minutes. If the controls are faulty, or they're just not operating as they should, i.e. the sensitivities are just wrong, or they're just plain don't work, then what can happen is you can charge all your heat on the cheaper rate overnight, and then it will just discharge when you don't want it to. So broadly speaking, on a very cold day forecast for the following day, you want those storage heaters charged up as much as possible. So you want that input control set high so that they charge up fully. You want the output control set low because you don't want them to discharge immediately as soon as you wake up. And this is the difficulty, because what sometimes happens, or more than sometimes I have to say, is that the output control is either faulty or it just not sensitive enough, and the heat's discharged. So let's say normal circumstances where many individuals aren't spending time in the house during the time, they just work away from the house. If the output control is faulty, then all that useful heat at the night is just discharged straight away. And therefore, when you come back at night time or in the evening, then you're going to have to use a more expensive rate to heat your home. So it's expensive, it's ineffective. For those that are working from home or just have long periods of time in the house, then you're going to need heat throughout the day, and it's managing that heat as effectively as possible. And if you're not able to manage that heat, then clearly that heat will just discharge, and you're going to have to look at a more expensive rate to heat your home. The tricky one is the THTC, the total heating total control. So what you find with that, you have 2 meters, and on your heating circuit, all your hardwired heaters are on the heating circuit. So that would be your storage heaters, your panel heaters, an electric shower, your water tank, an electric towel rail in the bathroom. And if you have a focal point electric fire, that can also be wired into the heating control meter. Your appliances, anything basically with a plug, will be on your more expensive rate. And that's really important because there's a lot of, it's significant because the high rate on THTC, i.e. the peak rate, is considerable, it's expensive. And therefore, if you don't understand how to use your storage heaters, or they're faulty, or many people I visit just worry about using storage heaters full stop and just put in a plug-in fan heater, for example, then you're going to be on a very, very high rate. So it's quite important that individuals know what tariffs they're on. And again, that's not to patronize individuals, because many individuals just do not know how to operate kit with the meter they're on. And quite often they don't actually know what tariff they're on either, which is really quite important in the fundamentals of understanding how particular kit works. Where we've made an advance more recently is in the technology on storage heaters, because high heat retention storage heaters are much more sensitive in terms of the controls. So therefore your heating rates when they charge, effectively the heater will lock down. If you don't ask for the demand of from the heater, then it will shut down and save that heat when you need it usefully. And the key is your useful consumption. You want to use everything usefully. And again, it sounds obvious, but many times you can't. So what you find with high tension storage is they're much more controllable, much more user-friendly. Yes, there's a bit of jiggery pokery setting them up, admittedly, and it's important that you make sure you tailor it to the individual household, because everyone lives differently. But once that's done, broadly speaking, it will be far cheaper to run. Far cheaper to run, assuming that someone was heating enough in the first place. Because the biggest issue that I come across in our part of the world is underheating. So comparable running costs can be quite tricky, because if you underheat, you're not actually representing what the heat demand for your property is. And therefore, what you often find is when people switch to another technology, the complaint is, I save as much as I anticipated. But what you do find is that the individuals are actually far more comfortable. So they're actually heating their homes effectively, but the cost is more representative of what it should be. and many people just underheat because they can't afford to heat in the first place. So that's quite it's a quick summary of the storage heaters, but it just shows you where advances are being made. What I would say is be very, very careful about some of the claims on electric heating. Some very fancy electric heaters are marketed very heavily, and they are not what they claim to be. They are not storage heaters. A storage heater operates on an off-peak tariff and holds charge, and it holds several kilowatts of charge. So, you know, anything up to 22 kilowatts, it will hold. Many electric heaters, they look fancy, they're marketed as storage heaters. Often it says German technology, but they're not storage heaters. It's high heat retention storage heaters that you're looking for there. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the other types of heaters, but effectively they are just heaters. You know, they are room heaters with controls. So just be careful of knowing exactly what it is that you're looking at in terms of heating. And again, this illustrates the difficulty of heating with electricity, because there's so many options. Mains gas, you get a boiler, that's it. You've got a mains gas boiler, end of. Fire it through radiators. Oil's exactly the same. So fossil fuel delivery is much more straightforward in terms of the technology. There are a number of electric boilers across the Highlands. They are hideously expensive to run, electric boilers. Effectively, you've got a big kettle that you're boiling up and heating your home. I find on my visits that the most expensive heating option is an electric boiler. Usually the average price for an electric boiler would be about £3,000 for a very modest property. So they're effective, don't get me wrong. It's a good heat delivery because it's a wet central heat and delivery system through radiators. You've got the full controls. There's nothing wrong with the principles of the technology. It's just the cost with which it delivers. And that's the key, because the unit cost of electricity is so high. What you normally find with an electric boiler is that marries with a economy 10 tariff. So economy 10 will give you periods of time throughout the day to heat. And broadly speaking, that suits the electric boiler setup the most appropriately. So that really is a sort of whistle-stop tour of electric heating types, both the dry and the wet system. One that I wanted to focus on, because this is becoming much more prevalent and widely available, is the air source heat pump. Now, I could spend a whole hour talking about how air source heat pumps operate and all the rest of the business, but that's another topic area. But essentially, heat pump is electric heating. It just delivers it through a different mechanism. But to all intents and purposes, you have a full wet central heating system, i.e. radiators, pipework, and a hot water tank. And broadly speaking, if you have 1 unit of electricity, you will probably convert to about 3.25 of heat. So if you think roughly about 300% efficiency, so for every unit of electricity, you're producing about 3 units of heat, and that's a yearly figure. What you'll find with heat pumps is that manufacturers will claim a particular efficiency. And there's nothing wrong with that, because broadly speaking, it's right, but that's in a sort of manufactured environment. What we're interested in is what that heat pump does over the course of a year in terms of efficiencies there. And in a factory, probably, well, it's over 400% efficient. So you'll get 1 unit of electric to over 4 of heat on many, many days of the year. But if we go back to February, where it's particularly cold, the efficiency will drop slightly. So what you want to know with heat pump technology is what it's going to deliver over that year, rather than just a very narrow ideal window where it's relatively mild. But nevertheless, it's still a highly effective form of heating, and it's full electric delivery. And normally an air source heat pump will run on a single standard meter, so it'll just be single rate electricity. There's a few instances where economy 10 can work for heat pump technology, But when you think electric heating, also think of your meter type. It's really important. I visited someone just outside Inverness. They had a THTC meter. The person that purchased the property from, for whatever reason, had disconnected the storage heaters, and this individual was just using plug-in heaters throughout the property. Now, it was a fairly large bungalow, but it was modern. It was detached, 4-bed, but he was racking up £5,500 a year in electric costs, purely because everything was coming off that peak rate because it was plug-in. So just by switching that electric meter over to a single rate meter, if he wanted to keep the electric heating, which wasn't a great idea because a heat pump would suit best, but just by switching the meter, you would shave about £2,000 off that bill. So, you know, there's serious implications there. But the one fundamental that we really do need to discuss is what considerations do you have for your heating systems, and what are the implications by going down that route? So if we think about our electric heating options, the electric dry, it's relatively straightforward. The units themselves accommodate in quite small areas. They're quite flexible. There's very little disruption because it's a straight wiring job from a Sparky, and it's quite easy to undertake as work. So in terms of the actual setup in a property, electric dry, storage heaters and panel heaters are quite straightforward. If we look at other delivery mechanisms such as radiators and pipework, then you need to start thinking about the space to accommodate the equipment, radiators, pipes, big water tanks, the heat pump unit itself. And also, really, really important is the suitability of the property to the technology. This is absolutely critical, and more particularly with heat pump technology. So we know whilst storage heating and direct acting electric heaters are expensive, they can still deliver heat to our properties in our part of the world. And our property type is mixed. We've got a lot of traditional buildings, many with extensions, multiple ages, multiple fabrics, and quite complex buildings. And therefore, they might not necessarily suit some of the modern technologies in their current state. And this is really, really important when we talk about heating in general, and especially electric heating. And I keep going back to this because if you have a delivery mechanism through fossil fuel, if you take the cost out of the equation, and I know cost is a huge issue, but realistically, if you correctly size the boiler, you can heat the house. It might cost a fortune, but you can heat it. With electricity, and more particularly with technology, if you don't retro insulate and undertake additional work, you will spend a lot of money and still be cold, and the property just won't suit that technology. So there's a lot of things that we need to take into account when talking about replacing electric heating options. The obvious areas are, well, let's just reduce the heat we need in the first place. So they go hand in hand. We're talking about electric heating here, but because we've got the highest unit costs, then it stands to reason that if we can reduce the amount of heat input, then we're going to reduce our bills proportionally more, because we've got such a big unit cost to start with. So we're always going to have the easy hits, if you like. So loft insulation is fairly straightforward. If you've got an accessible flat part of your loft area, pretty easy to insulate, and it's a really good return. So for relatively little investment and work, you get a good return. You still need to allow the building to breathe, so you've still got to have airflow above the insulation, but broadly speaking, very few issues with loft insulation, quite straightforward and very, very good returns. Other areas that might sound really obvious but are often overlooked, think about the openings, think about doors, windows, really easy things that can be done, simple draft proofing measures. Use curtains, blinds, shutters, anything that you've got available that you can use as a quick hit. You wouldn't believe how cheap some draft proofing can be. Often people will just do some ad hoc things themselves. It's very, very effective. I'm not saying it's a permanent solution. It's not an ideal solution, but it can work in the short and medium term just to cut down those drafts and heat losses. More expensive implementations will be replacing glazing. Replacing glazing is very expensive. That said, as long as the glazing unit itself is sound and it's fitted well and the windows haven't blown, you shouldn't really need to replace windows that often. Salespeople will tell you that you'll need to upgrade your glazing on a very regular basis. Now, my glazing is 20 years old. It's wood. It's good quality glazing. Now, admittedly, if I bought a brand new unit tomorrow, it would be more thermally efficient, but they're fitted well and they're doing not too badly. I'm not replacing it. There's no point me replacing that because it would take me years and years and years to get that money back. If the window was ill-fitting or it fundamentally failed, i.e. you've got condensation between the actual glass panels, then it's failed. So it's not doing its job. So it needs to be replaced. So they're the high-end measures, the glazing, but really think of the openings and think about the layout of the house as well. If you have an electrically heated property and you walk straight from an outside space into a main habited space, like a lounge or a kitchen diner that you spend a lot of time in, that is a problem because to recover that heat is really quite challenging. So if you have an area where you can walk from the outside into the building without losing the heat too much, then just think about using a different door. It's as simple as that. The way that houses are designed these days, and it just goes into the floor print area, you know, trying to maximize what you can get, is that very often, and very common in Inverness here, you walk straight from the outside into a lounge, open plan into a dining room, which is open plan into the kitchen, which is open plan into a stairway. That is challenging with electric heating because to recover that heat is quite difficult. Insulation on the floor. Many of us have got suspended timber floors. Depends on the void you've got there, but insulating under the floor can be very effective because there's a lot of drafty areas, more particularly on the west coast and the islands. If you underfloor insulate, then your returns on that can be particularly significant. If you've got more limited space or it's just too much hassle, then decent quality carpets and underlay and blocking any draft from the skirting is effective. It's not as good as a full insulation job on the under the floor itself, but it's relatively inexpensive and you do get a good return on it. A solid floor, well, don't bother insulating that unless you're doing a full renovation job. It's just so much hassle. It's really, really good to do, admittedly. So if you have a renovation project or the property's empty, then you might want to consider it, but there's some serious implications there. And this is where the whole discussion around cost return ratios. Some are very high investment costs with modest returns. Some are high investment costs with a really good return, and others are a low cost like loft insulation with a very high return. Wall insulation is another important area. So most of the properties that are built now are timber frame construction, so that's pre-insulated. A significant cohort live in solid wall properties, so sandstone, granite or whin. That is problematic to insulate, but if you can insulate it either externally or internally, that makes a huge difference in terms of thermal capability. So again, it's something that if you can invest in both time and disruption and cost, then we would recommend it where possible, but just don't undertake the project lightly because it can be a challenge to do that work. But what it does illustrate is that you can retro insulate as much as possible, you reduce that heat demand and therefore your heating option becomes far more flexible and it reduces the cost. And the cavity wall insulation is an interesting one. Pre-filled cavities can cause issues. There's no question about this. Cavity walls, broadly speaking, should be filled to make them more energy efficient with some significant caveats here. There are issues when you've got wind-driven rain, high exposed locations. The cavity is there for a reason, and the reason why cavities have failed, and there have been a number of failures in Loch Harbour, is because the material used to fill the cavity has got wet. It's blown fibre, and it's just not suited to high exposure properties. So sometimes it might be best to leave a gable wall or a high exposed wall, or if the cavity is particularly challenging, because quite often cavities do get filled with rubble or various other failures of the fabric. So you get all sorts of bridging issues. So cavity walls have huge heat losses. So if it's practical to insulate the cavity, again, it's an area where you can significantly reduce your heat losses, but there are words of caution with these types of insulation techniques. And it goes without saying, with any insulation technique, it's the quality of the job is really important, because your building still has to perform. If your building gets wet or damp, then trying to drive moisture out with any heating system is very, very challenging. And especially with electric heating, it costs an absolute fortune. So using the correct materials is also extremely important, because you do not want high humidity in houses at all. So reducing the heat goes hand in hand with your heat delivery options within the property, because what it does is it increases your flexibility. So what you ideally want to do is try and get a heat pump in the property, because it's so efficient. But a heat pump will only work in a property if you've taken steps to mitigate against those heat losses. And therefore, it's really important to look at the both areas. So, as I say, we can talk about this with questions afterwards if anyone's got some specific questions there. But I just want to highlight the importance of reducing that heat in the first place. Don't underestimate other areas. Heat is always going to be your biggest issue. And when we talk about climate change, emissions targets, the biggest headache that is causing politicians and policymakers is domestic heat. Domestic heat is a real issue in trying to achieve those targets. That said, we can still also help by reducing other areas of electrical usage. So just dismiss other. So whilst predominantly your electrically heated home, the bulk of your fuel bill will be on the heating, there are still other areas that you can cut down on. So there are power hungry appliances. Electric showers are huge consumers. Now, we recommend, if you can get your showering down to 3 or 4 minutes in electric shower, then fair enough. But if you've got a busy household, teenagers that are standing there for half an hour at a time, it can really start racking up the cost. You've got a 9 or a 9.5 kilowatt draw, and that is a very expensive bit of kit to keep running. So your showers is a really big issue. Tumble drying, this is quite contentious, this one, because of where we live. So tumble dryers are very heavy on the juice, it has to be said. So you know, we've got to be practical here, because if you dry clothes in a house, that moisture of drying the clothes on a drying rack in a room, the amount of liquid going into that room, 2 to 3 litres of water, the amount of heat required to drive that liquid out is actually probably more inefficient than a tumble dryer in the first place. So you've just got to be realistic about certain things. But using a tumble dryer when you've got alternative means, you know, err on the side of, well, let's try and get it outside if we can, but it's not practical for everyone. Washing machines as well. Now, to be fair, a lot of the washing machines now are pretty efficient, but just wash at lower temperatures. The whole point of these modern detergents is that will operate effectively at low temperatures. Now, I do accept that some washes have to be higher for obvious reasons, but broadly speaking, a 30 wash is fine. So that will considerably reduce the amount of energy required. Sounds obvious, but a kettle's got a 3 kilowatt draw. It's a big old draw. So if you're sitting in the house there and you want a cuppa, then don't put 3 litres of water in a kettle. You know, that's just kind of silly. You just need enough for yourself, or however many taking. It doesn't sound, but if you repeat that exercise on a daily basis, it does accrue quite rapidly. So just think about your big draws there. Also, appliances that are still on standby. Not so common now because the draws are less, but still be mindful of what you've got plugged in. Just be careful. Again, I accept that unplugging certain things and then having to reprogram can be a bit of a faff. So you've got to be sensible here. You've got to live your life. You've got to be practical. I would say that switching to LED is certainly advisable. LED lighting is great. I'm not talking about your CFLs. I'm talking about prior LED, instantaneous. It's bright. It works well. It's a low draw, and you can get different style of lighting to suit your needs. So I do a lot of reading. My eyesight's pretty poor, so a nice bright white light is effective for reading. You can have a yellower light if you just for a sort of softer lighting, but it's very, very effective and very cheap to run. So switching over to LEDs is certainly something that I would recommend. Oops, I've gone back the way there. That's pretty silly. Apologies for that. Just wanted to highlight this as an example, and this is an example in Loch Harbour. So this was an elderly couple, 2-bedroom semi, heating and hot water on for most of the day. They actually had an open fire with back boiler, very common, very little loft insulation, uninsulated cavities, approximately tons of a year, plus all the electric pup costs, and that was accruing, broadly speaking, 30,000 kilowatt hours a year, including the appliances. So that's fairly standard. There's nothing unusual in that. So if we look at the work that was completed on that property, loft insulation topped up to the full recommended amount. So, think about a foot. Cavity walls were insulated. Air source heat pump was put in. Now that is a 3,000 kilowatt hour to heat your home. That is what you can achieve. Those individuals now don't have to shift coal. It's a huge improvement to their life, and they've actually changed their tariff to another deal as well on their electricity tariff, which has saved an additional amount. So now I do accept that's a good example. The whole point of me here is I want to provide a good example. Not everyone can do that, but it is achievable. The situation with the back boiler is common in our neck of the woods. It's a setup that is it just proves that can be done with a renewable technology, and that heat demand is incredible. You've gone from down to 3,000 kilowatt hours. Now that is the heat demand. So if you add the appliances and all the other bits and bobs on top of that, you'll probably be nearer to 6,000. But nevertheless, you've got a net reduction of about 24,000 kilowatt hours a year, because regardless of that energy, it's got to come from somewhere. So the joy of the Highlands is we're all green anyway, because we're either hydro or wind. Now, depending on where you get your supply from, then there are different suppliers that will offer a full green tariff, because they can then provide the authenticity of the provenance of that delivery. So you will get a proper green tariff from some individual suppliers. But for all of us living in the Highlands, essentially we are net exporters of electricity to the rest of the country. So that's a very good example there of where you can save kilowatt hours. So in terms of Home Energy Scotland, we've got the free phone telephone number for people to call in, and we can talk about help and assistance for people to make change, receive that impartial advice. And we work very closely with community groups, local authorities, organisations just wanting to help people on an independent basis to make and facilitate change there. So I'll stop sharing my screen, because you're probably bug-eyed looking at